Greetings and welcome back to another exciting episode of Remake REBREAK. I've done a lot of recording for the Pokemon ROR with 4 out of 5 games fully recorded and a 20-page script in the works. Only problem is my collaborator, Haydox, has a lot of other videos he needs to finish working on, and we've got a lot of other things to iron out for Pokemon. And no, I have no idea why he's naked. The final video will probably be 90 minutes long, so I decided it would be best to get a shorter review out in the meantime. So I recorded Partners in Time and had a complete script all ready to go. Just when I was about to start editing the video, my computer suffered the great Windows update fail of October 2018. Despite my best efforts to back everything up before reinstalling Windows, I accidentally erased my second HDD and lost a whole bunch of shiny 4K stock footage, including the Partners in Time footage. Yes, I still plan to review Partners in Time eventually, but not now. So let's do a new ROR instead. Lots of people have been asking me to discuss the new Luigi's Mansion remake on 3DS, so I might as well cover it while it's hot off the presses. More recently, I've tried to keep development history on a need-to-know basis, but it's pretty informative in the case of Luigi's Mansion. Much like how Ocarina of Time 3D began as a 3DS tech demo before becoming a full-fledged game, one can similarly trace Luigi's Mansion back to a GameCube tech demo from Space World 2000. Looking at this in the Space World 2001 trailer, we can see a lot of ideas that never made it into the finished game, alongside this creepy visual that was presumably going to function as a game over screen. A 2001 interview with the game's director and lead designer suggests that the game wasn't originally going to be about Luigi or even a mansion, but sort of came together as developers threw ideas at the wall to see what stuck. To be fair, improvisational development cycles are apparently pretty common at Nintendo, especially when Shigeru Miyamoto produces. Just keep this in mind as we get into the game proper. Reception for the game was mostly positive at the time, with the greatest criticism levied at the game's short running time. Personally, I'm not sure what the consensus is for Luigi's Mansion. I know a lot of people who really like it and who all list consistent reasons in its favor, but I have seen negative takes show up from time to time. As for me, Luigi's Mansion is one of my most nostalgic games, alongside Yoshi's Story. I remember being 5 years old and tagging along with my dad all over the state to find a GameCube on launch day, and Luigi's Mansion was the first game we owned for the system. This was the first time I played and beat a game all by myself, and I was on top of the world. I must have played the Hidden Mansion 100 times as a kid. Interestingly, Luigi's Mansion was also the first game I reviewed on the channel.
Sup, I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and I love Luigi.
Yep, this one's going in my cringe compilation. Back then, Dark Moon had only just come out on the 3DS, and so the first game seemed like good first review material. At the time, I was proud to have simply published a review, but now, well, let's just say that it makes Season 1 Muted Right Audio Channel SideQuest Gamer look impressive.
Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all tomorrow for Day 3 of Hanukkah. Before we go, here's some bonus clips.
Actually, I take that back. I'm just kidding, Alec, I love you. 5 years later, my channel is much bigger, my content has a better defined direction, and Remake REBREAK is a thing. More importantly, Luigi's Mansion was recently re-released on the Nintendo 3DS, so now I have an excuse to replace my crappy first review. As always, Remake REBREAK is a review segment where I evaluate the classics of the past to see how well they hold up today, with a special emphasis on how well subsequent significant re-releases, which includes ports, remakes, remasters, reimaginings, etc., recreate and improve upon the original experience. Today we'll focus on 3 questions. First, how well does Luigi's Mansion hold up in 2018 as a game on its own? Second, how well does the 3DS remake recreate and improve upon the original experience? Third, how much would this remake have benefited from releasing on the Nintendo Switch instead? Without further ado, this is Luigi's Mansion Remake REBREAK. As always, we begin with the story. Luigi suddenly wins a mansion from a contest guessed he never entered, and upon following the letter to the site, he comes across a spooky mansion in the middle of a dark forest. Upon entering the mansion, a ghost attacks Luigi, but thankfully a ghost researcher named Professor Egad rescues him using the Poltergust 3000, a ghost-busting vacuum cleaner. Regrouping at Egad's underground laboratory, the elderly scientist informs Luigi that the mansion only appeared a few days ago, and that Mario entered and never returned. Concerned for his brother's safety, Luigi takes a crash course in ghost hunting and re-enters the mansion. Along the way, Luigi discovers that the villainous King Boo has sealed Mario in a painting and that his gang of mischievous boos also raided Egad's gallery of portrified ghosts and released them into the mansion. Thus, Luigi sets out to defeat the boos, recapture the escaped portrait ghosts, and restore Mario to his normal self. The concept of Luigi's Mansion is refreshing, seeing as up to this point Mario is missing was Luigi's only outing as lead protagonist. Luigi himself has always been my favorite of the two Mario brothers, both in the RPGs and the main series, and Luigi's Mansion provides him with a true test of his character as he overcomes his fears and proves himself to his more popular older brother. The premise of exploring a haunted mansion was also pretty novel and lends itself to many creative ideas. Considering Luigi's Mansion was a launch title for the GameCube, it gets my vote for the best looking game released in 2001. Compared to its contemporaries on the Xbox and PlayStation 2, the models, effects, and texture work seemingly age the best. Jak and Daxter is certainly right up there and definitely had the better animations, but the low-res textures, low-poly models, and 512x448i resolution give Luigi's Mansion the definitive edge for me. Actually, come to think of it, Sonic Adventure 2 managed to pull off a full 640x480p and 60 frames per second on the Dreamcast the same year. The environments compete pretty well, and the textures are surprisingly high-res. But I'm getting off topic. Luigi's Mansion isn't the best looking game on the GameCube. I mean, it's no Super Mario Sunshine, but for Nintendo's first stab at 40p, it holds up pretty nicely. I really have to praise the art direction most of all. Everything in the mansion is richly detailed, combining realistic texturing with extravagant geometry. It helps Luigi's Mansion stand out in the sea of Mario platformers and spin-offs. On the other hand, the human and ghost characters retain the rounded cartoony aesthetic the series is known for, from series mainstays like Boo's and the Mario Brothers to the new ghosts and Professor Egad. One detail I particularly appreciate is how ghosts aren't just transparent, but otherworldly and ethereal. Like I said, the only real weakness here is that some of the animations don't look too great, namely Luigi's walk cycle. He looks less like a human walking around and more like a robot awkwardly strafing in place. Everyone else, however, is animated adequately. I should note that the game supports 480p progressive scan with component cables or HDMI adapters, the latter of which being how I recorded this for the review. That said, without analog blur to disguise it, the lack of anti-aliasing becomes apparent. As nice as the game looks, I'm also not sure why this couldn't run at 60 FPS, given the small amount of on-screen geometry, absence of particle effects, etc. Regardless, the 30 FPS is consistent with only infrequent drops, so I'm satisfied. The biggest question everyone had when Luigi's Mansion 3DS was announced was, why not remake it on the Switch instead? A Switch remake would have HD graphics, fewer control changes, better online, and still be portable. Moreover, I'm not sure Luigi's Mansion really needed a remake, but I digress. If I had to guess why they chose the 3DS, it was probably for the faster development cycle and just to give people something to play on the aging system. Graphically, the 3DS's 400x240p top screen only has roughly 31% of the original resolution to work with, meaning that the remake would look technically worse by definition. That said, now that I have the game in my hands, Luigi's Mansion does look quite good on 3DS, and Grezzo did a real nice job recreating the visual style on a handheld. As usual, I'm recording this game on my 3DS capture card. The textures, despite being mipped down a notch, still retain the style and detail from the GameCube version. Luigi and King Boo's models were seemingly remade from scratch, but unfortunately Unfortunately, the elemental spirits have become simple sprites on 3DS. Nevertheless, on a 3DS screen, it feels just like playing the GameCube game on a handheld. In fact, I'm tempted to say that between the two of them, I might slightly prefer the 3DS visuals for the brighter colors and less muddy textures. That said, the pretty visuals come at a cost. Compared to the consistent 30 FPS of the GameCube, the 3DS version hovers between 20 and 30 FPS, with cutscenes surprisingly performing the worst. As great as the game looks, it doesn't come off as so technically demanding to rule out a consistent frame rate. While it's possible the game runs better on a new 3DS, it goes without saying that devs should prioritize original 3DS hardware and reserve the new 3DS for higher res textures, increased frame rates, and other enhancements. Regardless, the frame rate remains high enough to be entirely playable, and odds are you won't notice the drops unless you're a dithering geek like me. The soundtrack is pretty great as well, thanks to the contributions of one Kazumi Totaka, who also voices Professor Egad. He's joined this time by Shinobu Nagata, nee Tanaka. Together they produced music that's very uniquely Luigi's Mansion. You can tell the musician behind Super Mario Land 2 and Yoshi's Story had a hand in making this, but it still feels very different from those games in many ways. It has the usual cartoon Mario charm, but it also employs exaggerated, spooky instrumentation while oftentimes being very atmospheric. As usual, Totaka uses a leitmotif that is then remixed to fit a variety of situations, from Egad's laboratory to dark mansion hallways, with Luigi even humming or whistling the motif depending on his mood. The first Luigi's Mansion seems considerably more atmospheric than Dark Moon, and I'd argue this is primarily thanks to the soundtrack placing greater emphasis on ambiance and the often creepy sound design. The sound of thunder raging outside of the mansion permeates the walls, bats and mice scamper about, etc. Visually, the game also employs heavier shadows and draws more attention to lit areas of the room than the sequel. As atmospheric as Luigi's Mansion can be, the small assortment of tunes are still pretty catchy and memorable too. Again, it runs into the Koji Kondo issue of only really having like 6 unique melodies when you think about it, but for a game like this, that's perfectly fine. I'm happy to say the 3DS version recreates the music and sound design fairly well. Unfortunately, there are some hiccups, all of them with the soundtrack. The original game used sequenced audio, but thanks to the high quality samples, it didn't really matter. The 3DS soundtrack is also sequenced, and while most of it sounds the same, there are a few tracks with minor but pronounced differences. The only case where I'd say a 3DS track is actively worse to listen to is the Chauncey boss theme, where one of the instruments sounds like it's cutting in and out. Otherwise, the musical transition reminds me of Super Mario 64 DS, or it's not an exact copy, but it's more than close enough. Before we get to the gameplay at large, we need to discuss the controls. I hate hunting down gameplay clips and trying to write all this stuff out, but it's very important to discussing the 3DS version. Starting with the original, we have 2 broad schemes. Standard, where the left stick freely moves Luigi around, and Sidestep, where Luigi strafes with the left stick and turns with the right. That said, Luigi automatically strafes while vacuuming and uses the C stick to turn in standard mode, but in sidestep mode, he stops strafing when his flashlight is put away, a weird inconsistency that always throws me off. If I were you, I'd just stick to standard mode. Seeing as this was Nintendo's first game with 2 analog sticks and analog triggers, they incorporated them well. Luigi's movement sensitivity is smooth, and turning and aiming the flashlight in Poltergust feels right. I do wish there were options to invert the vertical aiming. As for the triggers, the vacuum revs up to different speeds depending on how far you hold them down, and if you have an element, a hard press shoots while holding blows. Holding the B button turns off the flashlight, Z opens a collection subscreen, Y opens a 3D map, and X opens a first-person search mode where you can read ghosts' hearts, unlock certain passageways, and activate a warp back to the mansion's foyer. Luigi will often comment on things he scans, but he never has anything interesting to say, and the heart readings often aren't that interesting either. To catch ghosts, you have to use flashlight beams to stun foes and expose their hearts, after which you can start vacuuming them up. As I mentioned in my original review, this can be kinda finicky.
Catching ghosts can also be kind of a strange ordeal. You're supposed to shine your flashlight at them, hold down R, jiggle the control stick, and pull Luigi back from them until their counter bleeps to 0. Sounds kinda self-explanatory, right? I mean, how hard could it be? But I swear that sometimes it just doesn't want to work. It's almost as though there's some unwritten rule about when you're supposed to stun them that the game doesn't tell you about.
Of course, my problem there was that my first Elgato didn't have a pass-through, so I was working with quite a bit of input lag. Needless to say, I had a much better time catching ghosts while recording for this new review, but every once in a while ghosts would just escape my flashlight stun, or they would just disappear completely, and I'm really not sure what causes it. Much like how I've learned to work around Mario 64's turning issue, my solution is to turn the flashlight off by holding B and only let go when the ghost is in a direct line of sight. This seems to work 90% of the time, but I still have hiccups with speedy spirits and the like. Obviously, the original Model 3DS does not have a second analog stick, and the button layout is pretty different, so some changes were necessary to get this game working across all models. Dark Moon, which came out in 2013, did this really well. Luigi would normally hold his flashlight in vacuum level, and would aim upwards and downwards by 45 degrees while holding the X and B buttons. Interaction and running used the same buttons using context sensitivity. The way ghosts moved and objects were positioned never required a greater degree of control than this, but you did have the option to use motion controls to tip the system up and down if you wanted. Despite this being a perfectly functional, simple control scheme that did more with fewer buttons, Grezzo decided to not even include an option for it in the remake of the first game. Movement is still controlled with the left circle pad, and while Luigi feels a little stiffer than before, it's nothing I couldn't get used to. Like Dark Moon, blowing and sucking are mapped to L and R respectively, and interaction is mapped to X. However, X now calls Mario's name while B strafes and resets the aiming level, which is useful but would have felt more natural in a bumper if there was one available. A controls the flashlight as before, but you're given the option to play with the strobe from Dark Moon. For some reason, however, the strobe forces you to strafe unless you hold B, while the flashlight lets you move freely unless you hold B. A weird inconsistency that makes the strobe feel janky when retrofitted into the first game. Otherwise, I find that either flashlight works better in certain situations. For stunning multiple ghosts, I prefer the strobe, but otherwise I find the original flashlight is quicker to use. Either mode still has the problem with ghosts sometimes escaping. The good news is you can swap at any time. Finally, the Y button activates the first-person search feature and you can aim with motion controls or the circle pad. Speaking of motion controls, that's how the game encourages you to aim upwards and downwards. Normally, I'm a proponent of motion controls, especially for aiming. See my dated review of Skyward Sword or my playthroughs of Metroid Prime, Echoes, and Star Fox Zero. However, in this game, the 3DS gyroscope just never worked well for me. On paper, it's the same as it was in Dark Moon, but no matter what sensitivity you pick, it always felt too fast or too slow, whereas Dark Moon's felt just right. Even then, the X and B aiming worked so well that I never used the motion controls. But that's off the table since those buttons do other things in this game. People with a die-hard opposition to motion controls might despair, but thankfully you can turn the motion controls off and use the D-pad. It sounds awkward, but you can press up and down to aim in those directions, and the left and right buttons to turn Luigi. For me, this was more reliable than motion controls, so that's what I went with. It took some adjustment, but eventually I got used to the 3DS controls and they started to feel somewhat natural. That said, for the first 2 hours of this 2 to 5 hour game, I spent much of it swapping around control options rather than actually playing it. And no matter how long I played, turning with the D-pad always felt inverted the wrong way. Any boss that requires you to aim in real time, like Boolossus, doesn't play nearly as well with the D-pad either. They're beatable, but if you played the original, it feels like a handicap. Having played this, I have a better understanding of what people experience playing Super Mario 64 DS for the first time. Still, there are some important differences here. When that remake came out, there was no alternative that could use an analog stick, so them choosing to go with the D-pad is somewhat excusable. possible. In this case, Nintendo passed over a Switch remake despite the inevitable control issues that would result on 3DS. Even then, Grezzo had a perfectly good control scheme on the table from Dark Moon and chose not to use it. I did eventually get used to aiming with the D-pad, but I would have had a much better time with the Dark Moon controls. Thankfully, Luigi's Mansion 3DS does have one saving grace that makes any growing pains with the controls a non-issue: the Circle Pad Pro, which adds 2 Z triggers and a second circle pad. Only a few 3DS titles support it, but it allows you to do stuff like rotate the camera in Majora's Mask 3D. In the case of Luigi's Mansion, it basically restores the original control scheme on 3DS. For the sake of review, I tracked down a Circle Pad Pro, modded it to fit a 3DS capture, and used it for my playthrough of the 3DS's Hidden Mansion. If you are going to play Luigi's Mansion on 3DS, I cannot recommend a Circle Pad Pro enough. The analog sensitivity is lower than on GameCube, but this should satisfy even die-hard fans of the original. Having a second analog stick for turning and aiming just feels better than the D-pad or the motion controls. Blowing or sucking using the Z triggers provides closer haptic feedback to the GameCube, and the ability to use the R bumper for the flashlight relieves any discomfort with using the right circle pad. It's not perfect, but it's by far the best way to play Luigi's Mansion on 3DS. Unfortunately, Circle Pad Pros are no longer stocked in retailers and cost roughly $20 to get online. Moreover, I wouldn't have to consider getting one if I could just play with the Dark Moon control scheme. Those who own new 3DS consoles might wonder how that stacks up, seeing as those systems have built-in Z bumpers and a right nub. Well, I don't own one myself, seeing as I can't find a regular-sized North American one for a decent price. Well, honestly, that one in the bottom doesn't look too bad, but do I even really want one? There's only like one good exclusive game for it, so no thanks. It doesn't really matter anyway, seeing as everyone I've talked to who does own Luigi's Mansion on a new Nintendo 3DS has nothing but bad things to say about trying to aim with the right nub. Considering people bought the new 3DS expecting improved performance and play control, the fact it's a worse option than an original 3DS with a Circle Pad Pro is kind of insulting. One other control change I want to discuss is the touchscreen. This is the new home of the map system, which has abandoned 3D geometry in favor of an 8-bit aesthetic. You can move the map around with the stylus, but unfortunately it's limited to this tiny window in the middle of the screen. Otherwise, you're told where your latest keys go on the screen like the original, and it's easy enough to locate where to go next. The collection screen has been relocated to the bottom left button, with entries selectable via stylus, while the Portrait Ghost entries have been moved to the bottom right button in a similar fashion. It works well for 3DS, and I have no complaints. Alright, with the controls out of the way, it's time to dig into the gameplay proper. The biggest criticism against Luigi's Mansion is its short length, a criticism I also happened to share in my first review. This game is only about 2 to 6 hours long, though that depends on how well you know it and whether you do all the optional stuff. Much like Jay and I argued in our review of Quest for Booty, what ultimately matters in a short game is filling the time with exciting gameplay that you'll want to revisit over and over. After all, I love the Metroid franchise to death, despite many of those games clocking in at only 2 to 4 hours. What those games lack in length, they make up for in replay value, attention to detail, mechanical depth, completion of side quests, and overall speedrun appeal. To add a fourth question to the 3 from the beginning, how well does Luigi's Mansion accomplish what it sets out to do, and how well does it incentivize you to replay it? As implied in the story summary, you play as Luigi exploring a haunted mansion while fighting ghosts, recapturing portrait ghosts, tracking down boos, defeating bosses, and gathering money. So let's go over each of these aspects in detail to see whether they pack the short running time with polished replayable content. First off, we have the exploration piece. The idea of exploring a haunted mansion is a good one and provides a lot of potential for a fun Metroidvania title. Think Scooby-Doo Night of 100 Frights, which was a surprisingly decent horror-themed Metroidvania game, all things considered. Dark Moon would throw out this potential for open-world gameplay altogether and adopting a mission structure. A controversial decision we'll discuss more when I review that game. So, how well does Luigi's Mansion live up to the expectations of the Metroidvania subgenre? Honestly, it hardly qualifies. Progression is so rigidly segmented that this game might as well be mission-based. To be fair, even the most open-ended Metroidvanias attempt to railroad progression to some extent. There's always a rough outline of where you're supposed to go and when, though depending on your mastery of glitches or advanced mechanics, it's often possible possible to go out of the game's intended order. Even putting those sequence breaks aside, Samus still has a lot of freedom to decide how to get from one place to another, and whether and when she'll collect the optional expansions off the beaten path. Compared to pure Metroidvanias, Luigi's Mansion is structured much more like one long Zelda dungeon, specifically the very linear Shadow Temple. From the start, almost every door in the mansion is locked, and the order that you'll collect keys to open new doors is cemented in a rigid order that will never change. You can't fight Melody without capturing Shivers, and you can't battle Van Gore without defeating Sir Weston. There's only one part where Luigi's Mansion opens up whatsoever, and that's the search for Mario's 5 dropped items. Even then, you'll find 2 of these items along the beaten path, and are required to play a trio of nearby second floor rooms to ultimately find dropped items elsewhere in the mansion. After this, the game goes back to a lockstep pattern of playing rooms to get keys to unlock rooms until the final boss. By area 4, the game keeps sending you back and forth from the basement to the 3rd floor, which wouldn't be so bad if there was an elevator or something. You can use mirror warps to get to the basement quicker, but if you need to get to the 3rd floor, you have no choice but to walk all the way back up there. It is true that some of the portrait ghosts are optional, and there are a couple of hidden rooms, but let's put a pin in that for when we talk about boos. The bigger problem than the linearity is that even compared to the Shadow Temple, Luigi's Mansion lacks any sort of strong puzzle elements or moments where you get to figure out what to do on your own. I really do appreciate not having to guess which key opens what door, but why even assign keys to specific rooms? I think the game would be a lot more open and a lot more fun if I could use keys on whichever door I want, while using stuff like boss keys or the elemental metals to gate progression to area bosses. In fact, just get rid of the area system altogether and make the game one uninterrupted session. After Chauncey, you could have the freedom to explore the entire 1st floor at your leisure, with Bogmire being blocked off by a fiery door that requires the water metal. Except instead of having it at the end of a railroaded series of rooms, you would be able to find it in a specific room right away if you knew where to look. The crux then becomes exploring rooms until you find the metal and can progress to the boss, while finding keys or upgrades in the other rooms that will be useful later in the game. The player would have a lot more freedom to discover their own best route for completing the game in the most efficient way, rather than shoving a rigid preset route down the player's throat that never changes on repeat playthroughs. The former is what makes Super Metroid so replayable. Every run gives you the opportunity to polish your route and complete the game that much quicker. It's truly a game that keeps on giving, whereas Luigi's Mansion doesn't really have that. There are some opportunities to tighten up a run, but not that many. Ultimately, I feel like Luigi's Mansion's rigid structure fails to squeeze all the potential of the ideas on paper, while also inhibiting its replayability with minimal opportunities to polish up future runs. Of course, exploration is only one aspect of the gameplay, and maybe a Metroidvania wasn't what the developers were going for. Maybe they were going for something more arcadey, like the Star Fox series. Star Fox 64 is as linear as can be, the occasional branching pathway aside, but people love it for the score attack element and the satisfaction that comes from mastering the controls and level design. In that case, the ghost busting would be the crux of the game, following the Pac-Man mantra of easy to learn, difficult to master, to incentivize players to improve their skills, rack up the high score, and finish the game as quickly as possible. Moreover, arcade-style games generally benefit from having higher difficulty, or at least a difficulty slider to further replayability. So yeah, both the Metroidvania formula and the arcade formula are excellent ways to wring replayability out of an otherwise short game. So does Luigi's Mansion capitalize on the second method to good effect? Let's find out. Let's start with the Mook Ghosts. Nick on Planet Ripple recently introduced me to the concept of the 30-second cycle. Basically, the idea is that all games are based on some element of repetition of roughly 30 seconds of gameplay, and the goal is to make those 30 seconds super fun so people don't mind doing essentially the same thing over and over again. For example, Halo 1 only really has 4 Covenant enemy types and 3 Flood forms, but between the depth of the gunplay and the challenging enemy AI, it's more than enough to keep the player interested in repeat playthroughs. Where Halo succeeds in arcade fun with its depth and challenge, Luigi's Mansion fails because it's mechanically shallow and too easy. There's nothing nothing wrong with keeping the combat simple. In fact, simplicity is the core of what makes arcadey action games fun to play. To excel, however, the gameplay needs to have some breadth and depth, and enough challenge to keep the player engaged. Again, easy to learn, difficult to master. I'm not saying Luigi's Mansion needed to be brutally difficult, but most of the combat in this game comes down to fighting wave after wave of a single type of ghost in a room over and over. In terms of AI, most of them just follow you around and then attack when they get close, and it's so easy to avoid that dying's never on the menu. Exceptions include Mr. Bones, who will throw bones from a distance, and trash ghosts, who will drop banana peels that interrupt ghost busting. There's also the hangers that drop bombs, but they're rare and die instantly. The problem is that even when multiple ghost types attack in the same wave, they're rarely combined to supplement each other's weaknesses. Imagine if you were being chased by several chokers while a couple Mr. Bones were throwing projectiles. Do you take out the chokers first since they pose the most immediate threat, or do you take out the Mr. Bones since they can interrupt your ghost busting? This is the depth that ghost busting is sorely missing, and when most ghosts attack you in fundamentally the same way, or are paired with the same type of ghost, you never have to make threat assessments or plan your attack. So for the most part, I just kind of floated through every combat section, employing fundamentally the same strategy for almost every wave, and I won. The only clever parts are these two rooms where chokers are invisible and you have to use environmental cues to zero in on their location and take them out. More ideas like this would have helped to diversify and deepen the combat considerably, but these rooms are the exception and not the rule. Basic combat wouldn't be a huge deal for me if it was just supplementary to the core gameplay. For example, the combat in the Metroid series is pretty simple and not that challenging, but it's also not the focus, which is on exploring, platforming, and solving puzzles. Since Luigi's Mansion has very little exploration and puzzles that solve themselves, that means the combat is the core by default. And when your core is just decent, that doesn't spell exceptional for the rest of the game. But then again, we still have portrait ghosts and boos to talk about, so maybe they can increase the game's overall standing. Unlike Mook Ghost, which exposed our hearts with flashlight beams, you're supposed to analyze the portrait ghost personalities and find a way to lower their guard so you can vacuum them up. On paper, this idea was clever and interesting, and there's a lot of room to improve if Nintendo brings portrait ghosts back in Luigi's Mansion 3. Otherwise, while I do appreciate something to break up the monotony of the normal mooks, portrait ghosts largely disappoint in most respects. Before I get into my criticisms, I want to acknowledge highlights from this ghastly pantheon. Madame Clairvoya is by far my favorite portrait ghost in Luigi's Mansion, seeing as she has the most screen time to flesh out her personality. She misspeaks her chants, comments wittily on each of Mario's dropped items and other characters, and in a neat twist, it turns out she never wanted to be released from her painting and begs Luigi to recapture her. Like all of us at a young age, Chauncey feels looked down upon by his elders, so when you fight him, he uses his ghostly powers to make himself huge and shrink Luigi, all the while showcasing how juvenile he really is by attacking you with toys. Van Gogh is also fairly memorable, if for no other reason than he created all the mook ghosts you battle around the mansion. The final highlight for me was Nana. According to her diary, and despite her unassuming appearance, Nana's actually something of a wild prankster who enjoys playing tricks on other ghosts. There are other occasional bits of flavor text scattered throughout the mansion, which would have been a great approach to fleshing out the portrait ghosts without interrupting repeat playthroughs. But unfortunately, I can only recall 3 of these in the entire game. Other than that and the occasional Cockney accent, these portrait ghosts are stock characters whose personalities can be summed up in single adjectives. The pool player, the girl, the glutton, the dog, the musician, the dancers. Well, technically those are all nouns, but you get my point. I guess their character designs are decent, and they do each have one-sentence character bios in the Game Boy Horror, but very few of them add anything all that interesting. Sue P apparently died in her sleep, but I would have liked a little bit more detail. I suppose portrait ghosts make the mansion feel more real and lived in, certainly more so than it would be without them. Unfortunately, that kind of clashes with the canon of the game, that Professor Egad captured the portrait ghosts separately during his world-spanning spanning career of 60 years, so most of these ghosts barely even know each other. Furthermore, the mansion itself is an illusion created by King Boo only a few days ago, so the ghosts have barely lived there. Thus, portrait ghosts would be more effective in this regard if they lived in the mansion to begin with, and if the mansion itself wasn't illusory. Of course, the depth of these characters isn't nearly as important as their impact in the gameplay. Like I said, the idea of portrait ghosts is supposed to be analyzing their personalities to expose their weakness. Let's look at the glutton as a positive example. You can tell from watching him scarf down food that he is a glutton, so the best way to get under his skin is to vacuum up all his food. As you do that, a couple of mooks come in to fill up his dish, implying that the other ghosts keep Mr. Lugs fed out of fear, giving him some added depth through gameplay. After defeating them and cleaning his plate, Mr. Lugs chucks a few fireballs at you in a heated rage, adding some mechanical challenge, before passing out due to obesity and heart disease, becoming vulnerable. In terms of Ludo narrative synchronization of characterization and building challenging gameplay around it, Mr. Lugs is a good example of living up to the full potential of portrait ghosts. For everyone else, unfortunately, these character-driven solutions are fairly tenuous and not especially clever. Supposedly, Shivers is afraid of fire, I guess. So you light his candlestick, which is an odd thing to carry if you're afraid of fire. He freaks out, then he starts doing whatever this is supposed to be and exposes his heart. You defeat Miss Petunia by spraying a little ice at her. You defeat Biff Atlas by hitting him with his own punching bags. You defeat Spooky by accidentally giving him a bone. And you defeat Melody by vacuuming up her evil music notes. Most of the time, I find the solutions to portrait ghosts by sheer accident rather than actually analyzing them for potential weaknesses, as Egad suggests. So all of that aside, are portrait ghosts challenging, puzzling, or otherwise fun? Not really. Beyond the area bosses and the other examples I brought up at the beginning, like Van Gore, who's basically just a mook rush, all of these guys are super easy and lack any critical thinking or mechanical mastery to defeat. Exceptions include Slim Bankshot and Nana, where you have to suck up balls and practice aiming and shooting at the ghosts until they become vulnerable. Arguably, the best portrait ghost battle is with the Clockwork Soldiers. There are 3 of them, and you have to try to vacuum each one up while the others try to attack you with pop guns. This one's actually somewhat challenging and requires you to strategize. In the case of everyone else, it's basic stuff, like waiting for the ghost to yawn or take a bow. A super easy minigame where you freeze Jarvis a few times, or flaming Sir Weston until he thaws out. Even calling these guys mini-bosses is being extremely generous, given how easily and quickly you take them out. Again, I do appreciate coming across something that plays differently once in a while, but compared to all the potential portrait ghosts had on paper, the execution doesn't live up to its full potential. That covers mooks and portrait ghosts, but there's one more type of enemy you'll have to capture to finish Luigi's Mansion. The recurring Boo enemies from Super Mario Bros. 3 return here, with King Boo serving as main antagonist. To rescue Mario, Luigi will have to capture each Boo one by one and weaken their collective strength. Thus, in order to fight the Area 3 and Area 4 bosses, Luigi will have to catch 20 and 40 Boos respectively, with 15 of them coming from the 3rd boss. And in my opinion, catching Boos is the absolute worst part of the entire game. The act of flushing them out of their hiding place is just busy work, especially since they like to randomly swap hiding places on a dime. In terms of fighting them, you have to keep aiming and vacuuming them until they succumb to the poltergust. For the first few Boos, this isn't too bad, seeing as their health is low enough to catch them right away. Later Boos see a massive increase in HP, and they have a nasty habit of running away to nearby rooms. If that room is locked, then tough luck. You'll have to wait until you unlock it to catch that Boo. Even in the best case scenario, you'll still be chasing Boos back and forth multiple times between the same few rooms until they finally give up. By the time you get to the basement and attic, Boos start rocking health bars in the 200s and 300s, and fighting them is an absolute chore, and it only gets worse in repeat playthroughs. I want to stress that this is not challenge. Instead of Boos staying in one room and requiring Luigi to dodge attacks or situational hazards, their only defense is to run away and waste your time. Thankfully, you don't have to catch all of them to beat the game, but you can only skip 10 of them, 5 in the Hidden Mansion. And because of the way the game's designed, you're faced with 2 equally undesirable options. As mentioned earlier, some of the portrait ghosts and rooms are technically optional, like Mr. Lugs or Sue P in the 2 treasure rooms. So do you skip those optional rooms and catch all the boos from the required rooms in the basement and attic, which have HP in the 200 to 300 range? Or do you play the optional rooms and catch the respective boos, which have HP in the 50 and 150 range, and skip 5 of the boos in the later floors? Then again, you're required to catch 20 boos to fight Boolossus, so you're all but required to play all the rooms in the first and second floors anyway. No matter what you choose, you can't really win. Finally, we come to the bosses. The main mooks and portrait ghosts are mostly really easy and lacking in depth, so do the boss fights at least offer some challenge and fun? Kind of. Chauncey's attacks are overly telegraphed, Bogmire's as simple as shooting a shadow ball to stun him, and even Boolossus has all the depth of a normal portrait ghost. Out of these 3, Chauncey is the only one to change up his attack cycle or increase in difficulty as the fight progresses. Every other boss largely does the same thing through each damage cycle. The only exception is that every once in a while, Boolossus's last boo can become surprisingly elusive and annoying to catch. Granted, I can most likely pin this on the increased difficulty of the 3DS Hidden Mansion, but I remember saying the same thing about Boolossus in my original review. Bottom line, in 3 out of 4 playthroughs, he was pretty simple for me.
Ah, spoiler alert!
While King Boo is the hardest and best designed of the 4 bosses, he's still not especially challenging. He has the most attacks and the most effective as well, and even while you're sucking him up, the Bowser costume's head will be shooting ice balls that you have to dodge. Still, good luck dying to this boss. Also, I have to ask why Bowser was necessary for this game, even as a costume for King Boo. It's like Sigma showing up at the end of every X game after you defeat the fake-out villain. This game was doing a fine job being a spin-off without relying on main series cliches. It's not a huge deal, but it does bug me a bit. So I've made my case as to why the exploration isn't great and how combat ranges from meh to annoying with occasional bursts of brilliance. Can the ranking system help pack this short game with meaningful content and replay value? After all, if we're looking at Luigi's Mansion as a sort of arcadey action game, then a ranking system is an excellent way to incentivize replay value vis-a-vis mastery of the controls, performing well in combat, or just clearing the game faster. Unfortunately, the ranking system in this game isn't really based on mechanical mastery, but rather how much money you find. The mansion is filled with coins, bills, jewels, pearls, etc. Depending on how much you collect by the end of the game, Luigi will use it to finance a new house, ranked from A to H. From the more Metroidvania angle, the money in the ranking system does bring up the game's standing for me on the whole. There are some cleverly hidden gems and a runoff pipe here or for watering a plant there. Moreover, there are optional gold mice that drop a ton of money, as well as speedy spirits that reward you with the cascade of dinero upon defeat. The money provides some environmental interactivity and rewards you for thoroughly searching rooms, whereas otherwise you'd just be going from room to room fighting ghosts the whole time. That said, this mechanic fails to live up to its full potential. Besides gold mice and speedy spirits, money is rarely a reward for solving a puzzle, overcoming a challenge, or doing something clever or interesting. You are rewarded with gold diamonds for watering this one plant and for catching all 50 boos, and sometimes you'll get green chests full of money for finishing an optional room, but that's about it. Most of the time, money is something you get for tapping on a piece of furniture here or vacuuming something there. Reading Mario Wiki, I also discovered that the size and amount of pearls you get from portrait ghosts depends on how much of their HP you suck up in a single vacuuming session, which is the right idea, but the game doesn't really tell you this in any way. Money could have been a reward for defeating enemies in clever ways or for clearing combat sections in a certain amount of time. Stuff like this would have helped funnel mechanical mastery vis-a-vis arcade experience into the money system, which then feeds into your ranking. As is, I got the best possible rank on my initial GameCube run, and I barely had to try at all. So I don't know. I appreciate the ranking system for adding some interactivity and exploration value, but I feel like they could have done a lot more with this idea than they did. Seeing as a first playthrough of Luigi's Mansion is pretty short, the devs tried to extend replay value with the second quest, the Hidden Mansion. Here, ghosts do twice as much damage, but Luigi's Poltergust sucks up ghosts at a 1.5 times rate. Otherwise, the Hidden Mansion is basically the same as the original mansion. in North America and Japan. Let's just say Metal Gear Solid 2 wasn't the only game in 2001 to feature a European Extreme mode. Regardless, out of the 4 playthroughs I did of Luigi's Mansion between the 2 versions, I think the NTSC GameCube Hidden Mansion was my favorite. When I discussed the game's rigid progression structure, I argued that the game wasn't that fun to speedrun, but I do think the Hidden Mansion's more effective poltergust makes it the ideal way to replay the game. I don't know why EGAT has to repeat all the tutorials when the player already learned this stuff the first time around, but I can mash my way through it all. Otherwise, you can clear combat sections and portrait ghosts much faster, and I managed to beat the whole game in about 2 hours this way. Again, it's nothing too special, but if I pop in Luigi's Mansion again, I'll probably replay it this way. One of the most promising additions to the 3DS remake was the prospect of bringing ideas from the harder PAL Hidden Mansion over to North America, though the 3DS adds some changes of its own to make it even harder. The placement of Mook Ghosts has been reworked from scratch, with more difficult ghosts showing up from the beginning and more ghosts appearing at once. Ghosts themselves all sport 50% more health. Including booze, and Luigi's Poltergust retains its original effectiveness. Bosses now feature new strategies, such as Chauncey's rocking horses swerving in a sine wave, or Bogmire switching from spot to spot more often. Additionally, the locations of Mario's 5-dropped items have changed, which throws a curveball at experienced players. Seeing as I always thought the original game was too easy, I was pleased to see ghost types combined in interesting ways that made for actually challenging encounters. Unfortunately, the designers had to ruin it all with one thing. Singular ghosts no longer drop recovery hearts, and all the hearts you could find around the mansion have been replaced with poison shrooms. Speaking of which, fuck these stupid things. I'm fine with ghosts attacking you and interrupting your ghost busting, but what I'm not fine with is having everything stripped away for 20 tedious seconds. Regardless, the only way to get health back without shelling out $20 for an amiibo scanner and another $10 to $15 for a Mario, Luigi, or Toad amiibo is to save the game and then kill yourself, or to suck up multiple ghosts at once. While the latter option doesn't sound like it would be too difficult, I swear it's the most finicky thing in the world and only seems to work a third of the time. You have to go out of your way to get ghosts in a position to flash them both at once, and most of the time I only end up vacuuming one. Needless to say, this is an unreliable way for replenishing your health, especially when the late game starts dogpiling you with 8 blue pounders at once. I really am pleased that Grezzo attempted to provide a harder difficulty for a game I genuinely found too easy. I'm even fine with the game being more challenging for increased enemy stats rather than new attacks or strategies. And I think the new enemy configurations are actually interesting to fight. These were all fine approaches to increasing the difficulty. But when I have no reliable way to heal myself besides respawning, that's a huge problem. And it basically means that you enter every combat scenario at an incurable disadvantage. No matter how much you strategize with using elemental attacks or how effectively you try to dodge, eventually you're gonna slip on a banana peel and die, or get nuked by a bowling ball from off screen, and it feels like bullshit each and every time. I want to stress this point so people understand why I can criticize the original mansion for being too easy while simultaneously disliking this new harder mansion. Not being able to reliably heal yourself without respawning is not fun, reasonable challenge. It's a handicap. The sad thing is that if it weren't for this, I would enjoy the new Hidden Mansion quite a bit. So the 3DS Hidden Mansion didn't exactly pan out, but how about the other additions? The Ghost Portrait Gallery has been completely remodeled from scratch so that everything faces the camera, and new paintings have been added with entries on each of the Mook Ghosts and the 35 boos that aren't boo losses. More importantly, the player is allowed to re-challenge all the portrait ghosts to see how fast they can beat them. Each ghost has a bronze, silver, and gold frame, with the new platinum frame rewarded for performing well in the harder Hidden Mansion version of each boss. Apparently the first 3 frame types were in the original game as well, but it's only mentioned in a terse sentence from the manual. Either way, the only way to get better frames there was to replay the entire Hidden Mansion, so this new boss rush feature is very convenient for those who want to get a full gallery of the best frames. Unfortunately, the precise requirements for unlocking the best frames aren't spelled out anywhere in game or even the electronic manual, so all you can really do is keep replaying them until the game gives it to you. I will say that having a second player along is very useful for unlocking platinum frames, since you can both vacuum the same portrait ghost for increased damage. Speaking of which, you might have noticed a gelatinous Luigi helping me with these portrait battles. That's because Luigi's Mansion 3DS includes a local co-op mode where you and a second player can bust ghosts together. Unfortunately, both players require a copy of the game to explore the full mansion together, and I wasn't about to drop another $40 in this game. Thankfully, Luigi's Mansion does support 3DS download play for the training room and portrait battle modes, so I was able to test out the co-op and get a feel for it. The biggest problem here is the atrocious load times. We're talking 33 seconds just to load the hub world every time. Doesn't sound so bad? Well, let's sit through that then. Obviously, if you have 2 cartridges, you don't have to deal with download time, so I definitely recommend that if you want to try the co-op. As for the co-op itself, well, it's awful. The frame rate during single player often drops below 30 FPS, but it was consistent enough to keep the gameplay somewhat smooth. The co-op frame rate, meanwhile, is shockingly bad. Like 10 frames per second on average, so many frame drops during intense action that you can't even tell what's going on. Bad. Even worse, I estimate roughly 517 milliseconds of input lag, which is roughly 15 frames at 30 FPS. Once the data's downloaded, download play shouldn't inhibit performance in any way, so this is just bad hardware optimization, pure and simple. We live in a time where a sizable group of people from around the world can play together in open world battle royale matches without any significant stutters in the performance. Meanwhile, Grezzo can't get a game from 2001 to run at 30 FPS on 2 systems right next to each other. This is laughable for 2018. And Nintendo's marketing has the nerve to act like this awful co-op is some kind of killer feature that justifies buying the game again. While it is nice to have help with platinum frames, with performance this bad, you're probably better off playing alone anyway. It's possible that Nintendo could release a patch to fix the frame rate, but in that case they should have delayed the game or at least soft locked the feature until it was ready. Or better yet, they could have remade this game on Switch instead, where 2 players with 2 controllers could play together on 1 console for better performance. Additionally, the Switch could have offered online co-op and leaderboards as well, in case you don't know anybody IRL to play with. So that right there was the 3DS Remake's ace in the hole, and it's crap. But surely for a game this short, Grezzo took the time to add a bunch of new content. Like maybe a mission mode where you clear waves of ghosts in a timelet, or possibly an all-new second mansion taking place after the first with new mooks and portrait ghosts, or even the cave area that was planned during development but cut due to time constraints. Well, there's an achievement system. It's split into several tiers with more unlocking as you clear previous tiers. If you're an achievement hunter who loves the original, you could probably get something out of this, but you'll have to excuse me for expecting something a little more substantial out of a remake you can comfortably beat in 3 hours. Looking back, the 3DS Hidden Mansion is the newest thing you're getting out of this remake, and that was ruined by the health replenishing issue. I think that transitions us well into the final verdict. Remake REBREAK. How well does Luigi's Mansion on 3DS recreate and improve upon the original experience? Frankly, I was really disappointed with this one, so I'm gonna go with the remake. I reserve this score for competent port jobs that are nonetheless inferior to the original, either because they fail to address the original salient issues or fail to add anything substantial. That describes Luigi's Mansion 3DS pretty well, unfortunately. For what it's worth, I do think the actual port job is just fine, which is why I really really don't think this is REBREAK material. The performance isn't the best, but it's very playable. The controls on base 3DS models can take some getting used to, but even at its worst, it's just a mite janky. Even then, if you own a Circle Pad Pro, then you've got a satisfactory equivalent of the GameCube controls. The visuals are loyal to the original's unique style and look really nice for 3DS, and while the music doesn't sound exactly the same, it's close enough for every track besides Chauncey's battle theme. So if you don't own Luigi's Mansion on the GameCube and want to check out the first entry before the third game launches next year, this is a perfectly suitable option for you. If you already own this game on GameCube, however, you are missing out on absolutely nothing by passing on this one. Looking back at my Klonoa 1 ROR, I gave the remake a lot more leeway than I really should have for its lack of meaningful new content given how short that game is. But at least in that case, the game had brand new 480p graphics and an updated presentation. The devs made an effort to make Klonoa 1 feel fresh and new. And while I do feel like Grezzo did the best they could to get this game running on 3DS, I don't really sense that they thought all that much about how to add or improve to give people their $40 worth. This game makes virtually no improvements to the repetitive combat, rigid exploration structure, basic portrait ghost puzzles, back and forth boo hunting, or even the overly straightforward rank system. Additionally, the remake removes the original's most speedrun-worthy scenario, that being the NTSC Hidden Mansion, by replacing it with a new Hidden Mansion. This new mode had a lot of potential and even some well-designed challenging combat scenarios, but throws all of that out the window with its god-awful health system. Meanwhile, the much-advertised co-op feature has a worse frame rate than the SNES Star Fox games and 15 frames of input lag on top of that. Beyond that, the only new things the remake adds are the achievement system, which is meh, and the portrait battles, which are decent at best. Luigi's Mansion 3DS has nothing substantial to offer in terms of gameplay improvements or new additions. And frankly, Nintendo charging $40 for a remake this undercooked is highway robbery. Even the Klonoa Wii remake only cost $30 when it came out. I'd say to wait for a price drop or sale, but this is Nintendo charge full price for Pokemon X and Y in 2018 we're talking about. This game will stay full price until the sun becomes coal. If this game was on the Switch, it would have at least had brand new HD graphics, more faithful controls, and much better co-op performance and even online support. Even then, I wouldn't want to pay $60 for that. Then again, did Luigi's Mansion really need a remake to begin with? This might be something of a hot take, but I think Luigi's Mansion in general is just kind of okay. It's not horrible or offensive and is often pretty decent fun, but on the whole, I can't describe it as anything better than alright. I mentioned before that the development for Luigi's Mansion was improvised, with the devs throwing random ingredients into the stew. And you know what they say about having too many cooks in the kitchen? Luigi's Mansion feels less like the product of a cohesive vision where every idea is taken to its logical conclusion, and much more like a grab bag of half-baked concepts combined into a mildly tasty stew. I want to repeat that. The problem here is not bad ideas, it's that we have a lot of good ideas that don't reach their full potential. The exploration? Well, this game is as railroaded as possible and leaves little room to experiment and tighten up future runs. The elemental spirits? Well, they barely do anything with that besides occasionally spraying things. The GB horror search feature? Luigi and the ghosts never have anything interesting to say. The portrait ghosts? Most of them are stock characters with minimal personalities who offer little challenge or satisfying puzzle solving. The overall combat? It's okay, but it rarely does anything clever or challenging. The rank system? It adds a little more depth, but getting the best rank is too easy, and you get most of your money from doing surface level exploration. This game doesn't really work as a Metroidvania because it's too railroaded, but it also doesn't work as an arcadey action game because it's too easy and lacks mechanical depth or challenge to encourage players to keep coming back. Let me be clear that these two methods are not the only ways to add replayability to a short game, they're just the most familiar. Unfortunately, Luigi's Mansion doesn't really add any incentives of its own to encourage you to replay it. It really tries with ranks, gold frames, and the Hidden Mansion, but none of these are compelling enough to make me want to pop the game back in. Ultimately, while I enjoyed myself for the most part, I'm left wondering what the developers were going for, who their audience was, and what the lasting appeal is supposed to be. What I'm trying to say is that the issues with this game are baked into its very core, and a remake that actually fixed the lack of depth, dearth of challenge, rigid progression structure, easy ranking system, and underwhelming replayability would be a completely different game altogether. So I'm willing to give the remake something of a pass for not attempting to fix anything, but even then they could have at least fixed booze running away all the time because nobody wants to play that. That said, if you are still going to remake a game like this, then you better damn well add a bunch of great new features if you're gonna charge full price for it. Grezzo didn't really do that, and that ultimately decides my rematch score. What Luigi's Mansion really needed was a sequel, not a remake. A new project that takes ideas from the original that work and expands upon them while adding new things to create something cohesive and fleshed out from the original concept. Join me in the next review and we'll see whether Dark Moon fulfills this potential. If you liked today's review, make sure to give it a like and consider subscribing for more. You can also find me on the Inversecast, where I meet up with Haydox, Ryrule, and King K to talk about video games and read bad fanfiction. You can find video versions of the podcast on YouTube and an audio version on SoundCloud. I also have a Let's Play channel, EPG Plays, where I offer informative playthroughs of games I like and some I don't. It's also the new home of Zebro's Play, sillier playthroughs I do with my brother. Be sure to go check those out. Until then, I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and I hope you enjoyed the review.